Okay, so we turn now in this video to Aquinas' third way of arguing for God's existence. And as I mentioned in our first video, this argument often goes by the name of the argument from contingency to the existence of an absolutely necessary being. And each of those terms really requires, those key terms requires explanation. So let me start again with contingency, which I've said a little bit about in earlier videos, but just to set the context for our discussion the third way, it would be good to say a bit more about it now. There's a distinction traditionally drawn in philosophy between what exists contingently and what exists of necessity or necessarily, sometimes put as the distinction between contingent beings and necessary beings. And what exists in a contingent way is something that, though it exists, it could have failed to exist. It didn't have to be here. There's nothing in its nature that guarantees that it exists, or once it comes into existence, that it will stay in existence. And it's accordingly something that depends on something else for its existence. Now, all the things in our experience are like that, all material objects. A table, a chair, a dog, a cat, a tree. These things exist, but they didn't have to exist, as is evident from the fact that they come into being and pass away. They are generated and corrupted, as philosophers like Aquinas like to put it. For any particular tree you see outside, or a particular cat or a stone, there was some time in the past when it didn't exist, and there'll be some time in the future when it no longer exists. And when it does exist, when it does come into being, there's something distinct from it that generated it, that brought it into being. In the case of a cat, say, the cat's parents. So by way of those features, these things exhibit their contingency, the fact that, again, they could have failed to exist and depend on other things. Now, a necessary being, something that exists of necessity, is just something that's not contingent in those ways. That is to say, it depends on nothing outside it for its existence, and there's something in its very nature that guarantees that it must exist. So in no way does it depend on anything else. In no way is it contingent on anything else. Now, what the third way is trying to show then is that where we know from experience that we live in a world of contingent things, this could not be the case, Aquinas argues, unless there were something that was outside the world of contingent things, something that was not contingent in any way, but necessary, something that could not have not existed. Okay, and so that's the basic strategy of the third way and how it differs from the first and second ways, which we looked at in previous videos. Okay. So Aquinas starts out the argument, as you'll note if you take a look at the text, that he puts it by saying that the third way proceeds from what he calls possibility and necessity. So he doesn't use the word contingency. That's a more modern way of speaking, but that's really what he's talking about when he talks about possibility versus necessity. By possibility, he means things that have the capacity to exist. It's possible for them to exist, but it's merely possible for them to exist as opposed to necessary, meaning they're the kinds of things that could either exist or not exist, and there's nothing in their nature that necessarily points them in one direction or another. Again, the way philosophers typically put that today is by saying that they are contingent. So he's talking about the same thing, just using different language to do it. And then he goes on to note that the way we know that these things are possible or contingent is that they are found to be generated and corrupted. That is to say, we see through experience that they're the kinds of things that come into existence, that's what it is to be generated, and they go out of existence, that's what it is to be corrupted. And that's a mark of contingency, because obviously something that was not contingent, something that was a necessary being that could not have not existed, it never has to come into being, and it could never go out of existence. So the fact that these things of our experience are generated and corrupted, they come into being and pass away, is a sure mark of their contingency. And the question is, well, is that all that exists, or is there something beyond that? And of course, the argument is going to try to show that there must be something beyond that. There must be something that exists of necessity. Now, why would that be? Why does that have to be? The reason Aquinas proceeds to argue is as follows, that a contingent thing of its very nature is going to go out of existence at some point. So that if everything that exists is contingent, then everything would have gone out of existence at some point. And that and if everything that ever existed in the past was contingent, And if we assume, for the sake of argument, as I've noted in previous videos, Aquinas does, that the universe has no beginning, he's willing to allow that for the sake of argument because he doesn't think he needs to show otherwise in order to prove God's existence. So if we assume that the universe had no beginning and that everything that exists is contingent, everything that's ever existed has been contingent, then since given enough time, a contingent thing always goes out of existence, it would follow that everything would have gone out of existence already, in which case there'd be nothing in existence now, which is obviously absurd. So what Aquinas is trying to do here is to reduce to absurdity, or show that it leads to absurdity, the idea that everything that exists is contingent and there's no necessary being. Again, the reasoning is a contingent thing, given enough time, inevitably is going to go out of existence at some point. And if everything that ever existed is contingent, it would follow then that everything already would have gone out of existence by now. And so there'd be nothing here now. But obviously, there is something here. You and I, for example, in the world around us. Therefore, he concludes not everything can be contingent. There must be something that exists of necessity. There must be a necessary being. Now, before I proceed and say anything else about the third way, let's pause to note some objections that often arise at this point. Sometimes it's argued, well, isn't Aquinas committing a fallacy here when he says that if a thing is contingent, then at some point it's going to go out of existence? Couldn't it be that some things are contingent, meaning they could fail to exist, and yet they just never do in fact fail to exist? They just happen to exist always, even if in theory they could have gone out of existence because they're contingent. And so the accusation here is Aquinas is just drawing he's just committing a very basic fallacy that because something could go out of existence, therefore it will go out of existence. Because something that's contingent and need not exist, therefore at some time it will not exist. But isn't that like saying that, if I could break out in song in front of one of my classes during one of my class periods that I teach, therefore I will actually break out in song? Well, fortunately for my students, that's not the case. Even though I could start singing show tunes or something in front of one of my intro to philosophy classes, I'd never have done that, and I hope I never will. I've got some shred of dignity, I hope. So from the fact that something could happen, it doesn't follow that it will happen. That's just an obvious fallacy. And again, the objection is, isn't that the fallacy Aquinas is committing when he says that if something is contingent, it could go out of existence, therefore at some time it will go out of existence? And his whole argument rests on that. So isn't he committing a fallacy? The answer is no, he's not committing a fallacy, because he's not arguing in the following way. He's not saying, well, if something could in theory happen, then it will inevitably happen at some point. That would indeed be a fallacy. That would be an error in argumentation, a logical mistake. That's not, in fact, his argument. He instead is saying something more along the following lines, that if something by its very nature has a strong disposition or tendency toward a certain kind of behavior or outcome, then at some point, given enough time, it's going to realize that outcome. Now, that's very abstract, so let me try to make it more concrete by giving you an example. I mentioned that the fact that I could sing show tunes in front of my classroom doesn't mean that I ever actually will do so. But of course, I have no strong inclination to do that in the first place. In fact, I have a strong inclination to do the opposite. I wouldn't want to embarrass myself by doing that or cause pain to my students by doing that. Contrast that, though, with something that I have, and all of us have, a very strong inclination to do, which is to draw breath, right? To take a next breath. All of us are just biologically hardwired to breathe. That's why we can do it in our sleep. We don't have to consciously do it. We're wired to do it, and it happens automatically. Now, we can try to prevent ourselves from breathing by holding our breath, but even if you're able to hold your breath until you passed out, your body would take over and start inhaling again. You'd start drawing breath again. Okay, so unlike singing show tunes, which I have no inclination to do, taking a breath is something I have a very strong inclination to do, so much so that, again, even if I were able to hold my breath and to the point that I pass out, my body would take over and just start breathing again. Okay. In that case, because I have this strong inclination, it is reasonable to say that given enough time, even if I hold my breath, given enough time, I'm going to draw a breath again, even if I hold my breath for a minute or 2 minutes or even 3 minutes, because I'm just biologically hardwired to do that. Okay. Now, in the same way, what Aquinas wants to say about the physical objects that surround us in the world of our experience, these are things that of their nature have, you might say, a strong tendency toward corruption. And the reason here, this is another case where, in order to understand the argument, you need to know something about the background of philosophical assumptions that Aquinas brings to bear. When I say they're assumptions, I don't mean that he just assumes them without argument. What I mean is that he's assuming them for the sake of the five ways, but he does give rational defenses of them or arguments for them in other places. Okay, and one of these background suppositions is a certain view about the nature of physical objects, and this is another idea that he picks up from Aristotle, and it's the idea that a physical object is of its nature made up of what he calls matter and form. This would be what in an earlier video I referred to also as material cause and formal cause. So whether it's a stone or a tree or a dog or a cat, there's the matter or stuff that those objects are made up out of, and then there's the form or the pattern that that matter has taken on to give you some specific kind of concrete object. Again, a dog, a cat, a stone, a tree, or whatever it might be. Now, with the way generation and corruption work for Aquinas, meaning the way something coming into existence or passing away works, has to do with matter gaining or losing form. When a stone it goes out of existence, when it's pulverized, say, it's crushed, what happens is the very same matter that used to have the form of stone now takes on the form of dust or powder, say, if it's ground to powder. Or suppose I take a dry erase marker and I draw a triangle or something on the marker board. The matter that used to be in a liquid form, while it was still in the pen, now takes on a solid form, and in particular the form of a triangular shaped object. And then when I erase that triangle from the marker board, that very same bit of matter takes on yet another form, namely the form of dust in the tray of the marker board or what have you. Okay, so when something comes into being, that's because matter takes on a new form, and when it goes out of existence, that's because the matter loses that form and takes on yet another form. But matter of its very nature, Aquinas argues, corresponds to potentiality, whereas form corresponds to actuality. If you remember that distinction from the first way, the actuality-potentiality distinction. Matter of its very nature has the potentiality to take on new forms and to lose the forms that it used to have. Whereas the form is what actualizes matter so that it becomes some specific kind of thing, a dog, a cat, a stone, or whatever it might be. Now, tying all this together, the idea is this then, that matter of its very nature has a very strong tendency or disposition to lose form and take on another form, particularly when something outside it acts to destroy it, right? So there's a stone sitting out there in the yard, and I might go out there with a sledgehammer or something and smash it. And so what's happened is you've got this bit of matter out there that's got a certain form, the form of stone, but the matter, because it has the potentiality to take on new forms, like the form of dust, is kind of waiting there for something to trigger that occurrence, which is exactly what happened if I hit it with the sledgehammer. Okay, or the triangle that I've drawn on the marker board, because it's made of matter, and that matter has the potentiality, the strong built-in tendency to lose its form and take on another form, is just waiting there, as it were, for something to come along, like me with an eraser, and erase it and trigger that matter's taking on some new form, the form of dust particles. Okay, so what Aquinas is saying is that matter of its very nature and the system of physical objects that make up the material world have this strong tendency to go out of existence. Give it enough time, it's going to happen. Just like give me enough time, I'm going to draw another breath, no matter how long I hold my breath. So his argument then to go back to the original objection is not, well, if in some abstract theoretical way something could happen, then it will in fact happen. He's not saying that. He's saying if something has a kind of built-in tendency or positive inclination to happen, then it's inevitably going to happen. And since matter of its very nature has this potentiality to lose form and take on some new form, and it's in a context of other objects that are acting to alter it or even destroy it in some way, give physical things, material things enough time, eventually they will go out of existence. Okay, so that's what Aquinas is getting at when he says that if you give a contingent thing enough time, inevitably it's going to go out of existence. Now, the next objection people sometimes raise is, well, even if Aquinas is right about that, why suppose that the entire material world, the entire world of contingent material objects would, given enough time, go out of existence? Why couldn't it instead happen something like this way? Why couldn't it be that when this or that individual contingent thing goes out of existence, then some other material contingent thing, which has already been in existence, carries on, and that when that one goes out of existence, yet a third one, which already existed, carries on, and so on and so forth, so that even though each individual contingent thing goes out of existence at some point, there's never a time at which they all go out of existence together. And in that scenario, even if everything is contingent, we wouldn't have this result that Aquinas says we would have, that the entire world would have gone out of existence by now. So isn't Aquinas committing a fallacy in that case? Isn't he committing the fallacy of saying that since every contingent thing is going to go out of existence at some point, therefore there'll be some one time when they all go out of existence together? And that would be a fallacy analogous to say that because every human being has a mother, there's some one mother who gave birth to every human being, all 6 or 7 billion people or whatever it is. And obviously there's no woman who's done that. So Aquinas is often accused of committing that fallacy as well. But in fact, he doesn't commit that fallacy either. There's another way to understand him, which is this. Again, he's assuming in the third way, for the sake of argument, that the universe is infinitely old. Again, he's only assuming that for the sake of argument. He doesn't actually believe the universe is infinitely old. But things will be easier for his opponent, for the atheist, if he concedes that assumption. So for the sake of argument, he does. And he wants to say, even if we assume the universe is infinitely old, doesn't matter, we can still prove God's existence. So suppose the world of contingent things is infinitely old, then Aquinas wants to say, yeah, you might go for 1 billion years, 1 trillion years, 100 trillion years, where you never have a scenario in which every single contingent thing goes out of existence together all at the same time. Yeah, that could carry on for quite a long time, I'm willing to allow in theory. But if we're assuming, as the atheist would as he's granting his atheist critic would assume, that the universe, the world of contingent things, is infinitely old, then that means we have an infinite amount of time to work with. And in an infinite amount of time, if something is at least barely possible, then inevitably it's going to happen. It may take 1 trillion years, it may take 100 trillion years, but at some point, if it's possible for all contingent things to go out of existence all at once together, then inevitably that's going to happen. And so once again, we have the result that if everything was contingent, then everything would have gone out of existence already and there'd be nothing in existence now, which is obviously absurd because there are things in existence now. Just look around. Therefore, we have his conclusion, not everything can be contingent. Now, at this point, yet another objection is raised, which goes like this. Well, okay, Aquinas, maybe you're right that not only will every individual contingent thing go out of existence at some point, but it might even happen, indeed, let's just concede it would happen, given enough time, that all individual contingent material objects would go out of existence together at some point, so that there wouldn't be anything in existence afterward. But why suppose, and so that in that case, there would have to be some non-contingent thing, some necessary being, something that could not have not existed. But why suppose that this necessary being would be divine? Why assume it would be God? Maybe instead we should say that the necessary being is some permanent underlying supply of matter that carries on when each individual material thing goes out of existence. Nevertheless, there's like this primal soup of matter, as it were, matter/energy, whatever you want to call it, that carries on and then immediately takes the form of new, specific, concrete, physical objects. Maybe it's just this supply of matter that is the necessary being, that neither comes into being or passes away. It's individual specific physical objects, this stone, that tree, this dog, that cat, those things come into being and pass away. And maybe all those individual things at some point go out of existence together. But the underlying stock or supply of matter, maybe that does not go out of existence, but carries on. And if that's what the necessary being is, then it wouldn't be God. It would just be matter itself. And so wouldn't that destroy Aquinas' argument? Wouldn't that block his argument? Now, the answer to that is no, it wouldn't block Aquinas' argument. As a matter of fact, Aquinas himself would agree, again, at least for the sake of argument, that matter, the matter that underlies all individual physical objects, might in some sense be a kind of necessary being, might in some sense be something that never comes into being or passes away. He actually allows that might be possible in theory. But that brings us to the next stage of the third way, where Aquinas says that there could be necessary beings which have their necessity in a derivative way. They borrow it from other things. And you might even have a series of such necessary beings where, say, necessary being C derives its necessity from necessary being B, and necessary being B derives it from necessary being A. So you have this like series or sequence of necessary beings. So he's willing to allow that, at least in theory. But even if there is such a thing, he says, what we'd have here is a regress or chain of causes of the kind we called in earlier videos a hierarchical or essentially ordered cause and effect series. And as you recall, Aquinas argues that that kind of series has to have a first member. It cannot go on to infinity, because every member other than the first one has its causal power, its ability to produce effects, only in a derivative or borrowed way, like the pencil or the stick in my earlier video, which has the power to move things, but only because it derives it from the hand, which uses it as an instrument. Okay, and so what he wants to say is, well, yeah, matter by itself might have a kind of necessity, meaning it never comes into being or passes away. He doesn't actually think that's true. He thinks the material world did come into being at some point. But again, for the sake of argument, he's willing to allow, okay, maybe matter has always been here. Fine, it's not going to make any difference. But even if that's true, even if it was in that sense a necessary being, insofar as it never comes into being or passes away, nevertheless, Aquinas would say, matter could only ever be a necessary being that derives its necessity from some other thing. And the reason is that matter by itself, as I indicated a few minutes ago, it is for Aquinas nothing more than the pure potentiality to take on form. Matter, just considered in the abstract, isn't any particular thing. It's not a stone or a tree or a dog. It's merely the potentiality to take on the form of a stone or a tree or a dog. And so matter considered by itself has no actuality, but only potentiality. That means something outside it has to give it whatever sort of reality that it has. So even if we were to allow, for the sake of argument, that matter could be a kind of necessary being, it would be a necessary being that depends for its necessity on some other necessary being. And even if there was a series of such necessary beings, it would have to trace back to a necessary being that has its necessity in a totally built-in or underived way. Now, something like that, Aquinas wants to say, would have to be something that is pure actuality with no potentiality in it. Because whatever has potentiality in it needs something outside it to actualize that potentiality, needs to have a cause, in which case it wouldn't be the ultimate explanation of things. And so whatever the ultimate necessary being is that gives necessity to all the other ones, if we're assuming for the sake of argument that we have this series of necessary beings, whatever the ultimate necessary being is would have to be something that has its necessity in a built-in way and doesn't derive it from anything else. Otherwise, we wouldn't have an ultimate explanation of the kind we're looking for in the third way. And that, again, would have to be something that's pure actuality with no potentiality whatsoever. If it had potentiality, there'd have to be something outside it actualizing it, and it wouldn't be the ultimate necessary being. So it has to be something that's pure actuality. But for the kind of reasons we talked about back when we were addressing the first way, something that is pure actuality would not be, for example, a material thing. It wouldn't be matter, because matter always has the potentiality to change its location, for example, or to lose whatever form it has and take on some new form or pattern, and so forth. So the ultimate absolute necessary being that explains everything else would have to be something immaterial. Indeed, it would have to be outside of time and space, because whatever is in time and space exhibits potentiality. It goes from one moment in time to the next. It's actually at this moment, potentially at the next moment. So when it reaches that next moment, that potential is actualized. So if something's purely actual with no potentiality, Not only can it not be a physical or material thing, it cannot be in time. It cannot be in space either, because things that are in space are physical objects. They would be material objects and capable of going from one point in space to the other, which requires potentiality. So this absolute necessary being cannot be a material thing either, any more than it can be a changeable thing or or something in time. Okay, and so what Aquinas would say is that when we unpack the idea of a necessary being, we find that it's going to have the divine attributes, just as we saw in the case of the first way, where you start unpacking the implications of being an unmoved mover, you start to derive the various divine attributes. So too in the case of the third way, we can do the very same thing, which would justify Aquinas' assertion at the end of the third way that when we reach the existence of a necessary being, we're reaching something that we call God, that all people think of as God. Whatever else God is supposed to be, he's supposed to be the ultimate explanation of why the world around us, the world of contingent things, exists. But again, as I've noted in earlier videos, it's only after he gives the 5 ways, in the sections beginning immediately after that section of the Summa Theologiae, that he begins to derive the various divine attributes and to show that the being whose existence he's argued for in the 5 ways would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, immaterial, unchangeable, unique, and that there can only be one, and so on and so forth. Okay. And we've had time only to kind of sketch out some of those arguments since our focus is on the 5 ways. But again, Aquinas is not open to the objection that he's simply jumping to conclusions when he gets from the conclusion of his 5 ways to the conclusion that he's proven the God of traditional theism, because he does prove for each of these divine attributes. He gives arguments for each of these divine attributes that the being whose existence he's argued for in these different arguments, including the third way, is indeed God, indeed has all these divine attributes. Okay, so that in outline is the argument from contingency, the third way. With this argument, as with the others, we have one that, as I say, has to be read in context in order properly to be understood. And a lot of modern readers fail to do that. They just look at the excerpt from the 5 ways and they think that that by itself is a kind of one-stop shopping way of understanding the argument. But that's a mistake. As what I've said in the video indicates, among the things you have to understand about this argument is the Aristotelian background, what it is to be a material object, the role that the concepts of actuality and potentiality play in understanding what it is to be a material object. It's also useful to know that in the third way, we have an argument that commentators on Aquinas typically see as an extension or adaptation on Aquinas' part of an argument that was presented earlier in the history of philosophy by the medieval Islamic philosopher Avicenna, who also gives an argument from the existence of contingent things to the existence of God as an absolutely necessary being. Though his version of the argument is significantly different from Aquinas'. There's certain twists in the argument that take it in Aquinas' version of it in a somewhat different direction. The point, though, is that this argument, like the others Aquinas presents in the 5 ways, have a long and rich history preceding Aquinas' statement of them in the Summa, where that statement is just intended as a kind of brief summary or overview. But properly to understand them, we need to take a look at this larger context, both in Aquinas' writings and in the history of philosophy before Aquinas, as he's appropriating and transforming for his own purposes the ideas of earlier thinkers like Aristotle, Avicenna, and others. Okay, so that's a look at the third way. Naturally, then we're going to look in our next video at the fourth way, and so we'll see you then.